principles on business and human rights, and the ILO M&E declaration, that the relevant parts of the OECD guidelines are aligned with those instruments. So there's no contradictory expectations across the different international instruments. The important things to remember about the guidelines are they are a set of voluntary recommendations addressed to business from governments who have adhered to them. There are currently 52 different governments around the world that are adherents, and there's actually an inbuilt grievance mechanism to receive complaints about alleged breaches of the guidelines. So they apply to companies that are operating from or in adherent countries. So this is where a link to conducting business in ASEAN member countries comes in. So for example, companies that are headquartered in or operating from a country that adheres to the guidelines, so the Netherlands, Japan, Australia, any of those 52 countries, those companies are expected to follow the guidelines. So since the year 2000, there have been more than 700 complaints that have come through these grievance mechanisms in the adherent countries about alleged breaches of the guidelines. And more than 10% of those have been related to activities in ASEAN member states. So it relates in that sense. So they're a very important resource for business to give very clear guidance on the different aspects of conduct and what expectations of responsible business look like. But when it comes to something allegedly going wrong, they're also an avenue for affected communities to use to seek remedy. And the last thing to remember is that the guidelines incorporate an expectation that companies use risk-based due diligence to identify and address potential harms in their operations. So what is risk-based due diligence for responsible business conduct? The best source of an explanation for this is this publication on the screen. It came out in 2018. The guidance, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, and it explains in plain language, step by step, how companies can conduct due diligence. In summary, it's a framework that provides a process for companies to identify and manage actual or potential negative impacts a company may have on people or the environment. And it's available in 17 different languages, including Dutch and a number of Southeast Asian languages. Some important things to remember about the due diligence process is that it is about preventing harms and that it's an ongoing process that involves engaging with stakeholders such as workers and local communities. So it's not something that's just done once. It's something that is embedded into the systems of a company, and this will look different in an SME to what it looks like in a much larger multinational, and that is reflected in the guidance itself. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. The expectation for companies is that it should really be tailored to the company's size and capacity and the sorts of risks that are in their operations and supply chains. When we talk about risk-based, this is a really key term because it means that companies are expected to focus their resources on addressing the most likely and severe harms in their operations or supply chains. Now, the guidance that I showed you, the 2018 document, is almost 100 pages long because it provides that step-by-step instruction. But perhaps you're looking for a shorter summary to explain what this is all about. So I can point you towards this 4-page essentials document, which is also available in multiple languages. You can access here or through these slides after the webinar. Now, I just need to check because we had some connectivity problems. I'm not sure if my colleague is online yet, in which case we might jump across.
Not yet, unfortunately.
Not yet. Okay, we'll hear from Emily as soon as she can connect, hopefully. So what I'll do is I will go forward and briefly touch on the resources that are available for companies who want to know more about responsible business conduct. So some of these are particularly relevant for businesses who are operating in ASEAN. So in addition to that 2018 document that I mentioned, there are actually sector-specific guidance as well. And these come from the need for, there's very particular risks and different, different types of companies are dealing with very different situations and supply chains, business partners, stakeholders. So there's a deep wealth of work on garment and footwear supply chains, and that's all available on the OECD website. There's a guidance there on the screen. There's also mineral supply chains, a number of different specific guidance to assist companies who are navigating some of the risks associated with those, and also agricultural supply chains as an example. Here are some more examples. There are handbooks that delve into some of the specific problems, or not problems, but things people need to be able to manage. The environmental due diligence in mineral supply chains, for example, and also the topic of a living wage in the garment and footwear sector. And also, so just to give you a flavor, there are a number of different things available that might be useful to you and your business partners or your company. We also have an e-learning academy on responsible business conduct that has different modules for different sectors, and that's free and something people can do at their own pace. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that the OECD, obviously in terms of implementing responsible business conduct, sustainability initiatives are something that is really a key element to all of this and to assist companies to meet different standards. So by sustainability initiatives, I mean industry schemes, multi-stakeholder initiatives, or certifications that set requirements or assess an organization's products or performance against these standards. So the OECD has done a lot of work with these initiatives to support their efforts to ensure they're credible and aligned with the international standards. And just briefly, our work in the Asia Pacific region is supported by a project funded by the European Union, which you can read more about here on these slides, which you'll receive afterwards on the project's website. And on that website, we've collated all the different resources that I've mentioned that are available in Asian languages. So that's a good place to go if you're wanting to see what is there. The last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a specific in-depth training opportunity available for companies operating in the region in the electronics and vehicle manufacturing sectors that is starting this month. So we would warmly
Kate, we cannot hear you anymore. Kate, are you still there? Because we cannot hear you anymore, unfortunately. We can still see your screen, but we cannot hear you anymore.
Can you hear me? You should be able to hear me now. Okay.
Very softly, but you might want to turn the mic up.
Okay. Sorry, everybody.
Kate, I'm going to jump in if that's okay to say hi and sorry for being late.
Okay, great. And
Thanks.
you can kind of hear me. Okay, I'll pass to Emily, but I'll share the screen for you, Emily.
Thanks very much. And sorry, I didn't receive the link for this call properly. So I've been sitting around waiting for that. Sorry to everyone.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks, Kate. Just to speak through, and I'm noting the time, so I'll keep brief. Do I have a little bit less than 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, Kate?
Yeah.
No, thanks. And I just wanted to speak briefly to the regulatory trends that we see at the OECD. We do have a growing work stream that are working on regulation, ranging across the full suite of due diligence laws, and very focused on issues of alignment with the international standards. So if we could jump to the next slide, I'll just speak a little bit through the landscape that we see at the moment. And then happy to take questions also on the nature of the work that we do. First slide, which probably a little bit difficult if you're on small screens to see, but really this is just to show you, of course, the very extensive landscape of sustainability requirements, which is growing in size and complexity, as I'm sure you're all very well aware. This does include, of course, in recent years, many laws now addressing due diligence, both in terms of requirements requiring due diligence and requirements that are requiring disclosure or public reporting on due diligence as well, which is the main focus of this slide and the examples on the slide. Approximately 75% of OECD countries now have introduced or in the process of introducing legislation or some form of regulation embedding due diligence into their expectations. And non-OECD countries have also introduced legislation or are considering legislation. Many of the examples on this slide, just to add, are explicitly reference the OECD standards, or they're based on the OECD standards and the other international frameworks. And I should note as well that they are of course part of a much wider smart mix of policy measures on due diligence, ranging from government-backed standards and voluntary guidances, not least in the Japanese 2022 guidelines on respecting human rights, but of course also requirements of commodity exchanges like the London metals exchange, stock exchanges, requirements of industry schemes, certifications, etc. Many of these are now introducing due diligence and disclosure requirements based on the OECD standards. And on to the next slide, Kate, thank you. This slide is just to show you how we try to conceptualize that landscape that I showed you on the prior slide. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but this is how we work on these and sort of compartmentalize a little bit at the OECD. First is the disclosure requirements. And again, you've got a list of some examples there. Second are the due diligence conduct requirements, where of course we've seen most development in the EU, both at the national level and then at the EU level in terms of both horizontal legislation cutting across a lot of different sectors like the CSDD and some of the national laws, but then of course these quite specific tailored approaches on due diligence specific to particular commodities, products, or sectors and issues. And then the third bucket we call product and market-based measures, and these, of course, are the laws that are now taking a slightly stricter and harder approach, where they're banning products from certain markets where those are linked to specific risks or risk thresholds or risks that haven't been specifically addressed, and the main issues that are being addressed here, of course, are deforestation and forced labor. Onto the, actually, sorry, just before I move on to the next slide, I just wanted to flag that despite the broad uptake that you can see from those two slides, and actually the relevance of the international standards across a lot of these laws and the very explicit references in these laws to the international standards, clearly there's a lot of divergence as well in how governments are defining due diligence, understanding due diligence, and how closely they align their own approaches with the core principles in these standards. And I think from our perspective, it's maybe worth saying that national approaches, of course, differ, and we fully recognize that, both in the case of decisions on mandatory versus voluntary, but of course in terms of the specific scope decisions that governments make, the issues that they decide to focus on. But we're also at the OECD concerned to see that, of course, there is a proliferation of requirements which, where they're not aligned or where there are differences, sometimes quite slight, but differences in terminology, that does create a lot of confusion, potentially conflicting laws and a lack of clarity for business. So this, of course, I mean, I'm speaking to an audience that would know this well, but generates compliance costs, it generates confusion, and it generates unpredictable outcomes along the supply chain. And I'm thinking, of course, on the particularly the SME business partners that are impacted. So I just wanted to flag before I go on to the next slide that the OECD is working a lot now on international policy coherence, and I'm happy to take questions on that later, but bringing together governments, a very wide group of governments now, to really zoom in and address issues of coherence, divergence, and interoperability. Thanks, Kate. Here, I imagine Kate's spoken a little bit to some of the core elements of due diligence, so I don't want to duplicate too much, again, noting the time. But this slide just speaks to some of the myths that we're really seeing in the context of the discussions we have on regulation, both in terms of how policymakers might understand due diligence, but also on the implementation side, how companies sometimes do see due diligence. I wanted to flag 3 buckets here. One is this idea that companies should do everything everywhere all at once. Due diligence, as I'm sure many of you again are aware, is of course about prioritization, and getting that prioritization piece right is a challenge, but it's also extremely important. And it's been a big topic of focus for the CSDDD that I'll touch on later, where governments are really trying to set common standards on what that means, consistent with the international frameworks. Second, the myth that there is, particularly from, I think, it's coming up a lot in the discussions in the EU, but there are sort of no limits on what's expected for companies. Yes, there are, of course, in terms of due diligence, for example, being proportionate, avoiding one-size-fits-all approaches. The expectations need to be reasonable in the laws, but they also need to be reasonable in terms of how governments are enforcing these laws. And expectations, of course, are also tailored in terms of proportionality, also tailored to the company's specific circumstances, its size, but also it's the nature of its involvement, how close it is to the impact is a major factor, of course. The leverage it has over its suppliers is another factor of consideration. And yeah, I think a lot of this is very difficult actually to get into and translate into a mandatory law. But we're seeing, therefore, increasingly in the EU, again, the need for very clear narrative guidance that sets out these concepts for companies in a way that is clear and consistent. Myth number 3, I wanted to just, again, I think Kate would have flagged this a little bit, but this idea of risk-free supply chains or non-compliance being associated with a degree of risk is quite different, of course, to the OECD due diligence approach, which is about companies being measured and judged not by the level of risk or the level of impact, but on the level of progress and on the level of engagement and improvement that they have against their targets. So again, this at its core, due diligence is about engagement with the supply chain, not disengagement, not cut and run approaches. It's really about addressing the risks, not running away from them. Thanks, Kate. I think I'll very much skim over this slide to jump to the next 2, but just to say we do have this slide up. It's looking a bit text dense, but just to say that, of course, the omnibus package that's being discussed in the EU is highly relevant, I imagine, to many of you, and I would expect a lot of you are following some of the detail. But just to say that we We, of course, are monitoring Omnibus 1 in particular, which is addressing the CSDD. It's also addressing the CSRD, so the reporting framework in the EU on sustainability impacts. It's also looking at taxonomy, the taxonomy in the EU and the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I won't discuss that in the interest of time, but again, happy to take questions. The main point there I would just flag is that the content of what's being discussed and the content of the amendments is very much being in consideration. It's going through the legislative process now. So there's very little clarity on what will come out of that. Thanks, Kate. I wanted to very, very briefly again speak to this law, EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, noting all the uncertainty around Omnibus and the direction of travel that the EU is now going in with its simplification package. But I thought it might just be a good time to recall that actually the text that was on the table and has been adopted and is the law as it stands is, of course, a hugely significant piece of legislation. It's one of the most significant pieces of law that we've seen. It's introducing, of course, risk-based due diligence for companies. It's introducing an obligation to adopt and put into effect a climate mitigation plan, and it's introducing a civil liability regime. All of those elements are quite novel in terms of the combination of those elements as well, as is actually the consistency and alignment with the international standards, where there are extremely strong references to the standards. The law is very clearly based on the 6-step due diligence framework of the OECD RBC guidance. And I think happy to move to questions soon, but I would just also like to flag that there are, of course, scope differences, and there are different. The EU law, for example, targets large companies. Our standards, of course, apply to all multinational enterprises. It also targets human rights and environmental impacts. Our standards are broader. They would expect companies to be looking at governance, corruption, bribery impacts, for example. And the financial sector scope is a bit different, where our standards, of course, apply broadly to the financial sector. The financial sector is largely scoped out of the CSDD. But despite all of these differences in scope, the actual due diligence expectations are very, very broadly consistent with the OECD framework, and that's shown on the next slide, where I'll leave that up rather than speaking too much to it, I think. But broadly, Kate's spoken to the steps. The articles in the CSDDD very much align with those steps and that framework. I think just to end and conclude here, I would, again, it's just a reminder that we are looking at a very large global landscape of laws, well beyond the EU, well beyond the CSDDD. And in that context, it's worth remembering that a lot of these laws do have the same ultimate aims and goals in terms of making sure that companies better know their supply chain and show what they're doing. So the knowing and showing element is really at the root of all of these, and show what they're doing to find and address risks. So there's a lot of commonality in objectives and aims, even if, of course, there are differences in scope across those laws that I showed you and the specificity. But with that in mind, the OECD guidelines, the international frameworks, the due diligence guidance, and the concepts of due diligence really are central, and they're a common red thread across a lot of the laws, admittedly not all of them. But in that way, they're a very important basis. And I think we'd really encourage companies to be looking at them. It's a very holistic approach where you're taking a comprehensive, holistic look across your ESG or RBC risks rather than siloed approaches. And actually having the right systems in place to do that will really take you 70, maybe 80% there in terms of a lot of these laws. And then it's, of course, about the adding on the specificity that's needed. Finally, just to say that we have launched a new due diligence policy platform where we're discussing a lot of the challenges of implementation across all of these laws with governments. So happy to take questions on that as well. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Emily. Hopefully I am audible. People can hear me. Please let me know if you can't. We'll jump straight to hearing from our panelists. So over to Nadia Yates, who's the Senior Human Rights Manager at Unilever. We wanted to hear about how Unilever is approaching supply chain due diligence in ASEAN markets, and what some of the practical steps that Unilever is taking what have been the most effective.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Just firstly to say that we have a clear commitment to respect for human rights, which expands right across our global operations and our value chain. Our approach for many years, in fact, since the UN Guiding Principles were published, has been on focus on embedding and really implementing the UN Guiding Principles and also the OECD Guidelines for M&Es. And this approach includes carrying out risk-based human rights due diligence and collaborating with others to drive systemic change. As Emily outlined just on those recent slides, legislation varies globally. And so our approach is really, when we're considering all the different legislations we have to adhere to actually hold the UNGPs as our North Star. And that enables us to align with the regulation that's currently enforced, as well as preparing effectively as new ones are enacted and rolled out. Our expectations of ourselves and our business partners are laid out in a coherent policy framework, which is expected as part of the human rights due diligence process, and in some cases extends beyond complying with local legal requirements. So we expect our suppliers to meet international standards where these go beyond the local law. Central to our approach to human rights due diligence is engaging with rights holders. This really helps us improve our understanding of the local context and the nuances that exist with some complicated and complex human rights issues that we look to address. Of particular relevance to the ASEAN market is the Principles in Support of Human Rights Defenders, which we published back in 2023. And this makes clear our zero tolerance of abuse, threats and intimidation or reprisals against human rights defenders. These have been communicated to relevant business partners and include processes that organisations can take to ensure that they are not having a negative impact on human rights defenders. Our human rights due diligence process also requires us to take action to prevent and mitigate potential and actual human rights impacts. And where actual impacts have been identified, we have processes to carry out remediation. When we're thinking about prevention and mitigation activities, we engage in capability building, including the ASEAN region, to increase awareness and understanding of our collective responsibilities. So this includes partnering with an organisation called AIM Progress, which is a member organisation comprising of many global food and drink manufacturing businesses, and the IOM on a programme specifically around responsible recruitment and effective grievance mechanisms. And this programme specifically focuses on Thai supply chains. We're also involved in AIM Progress's Ganapati project for suppliers in Malaysia and Thailand, and this focuses again on raising awareness of responsible recruitment practices and supporting suppliers in those countries to embed effective responsible recruitment practices in their own organisations. A really key part of our approach is to partner with local actors on the ground, because they bring the knowledge and the expertise of the local context. They help to break down some of those cultural barriers, help us understand how to take these global concepts and really make them relevant for the specific market in which we're operating and the individuals that we're engaging with. We use technology to gather insights from migrant workers. So we recently carried out a project in the Thai sugarcane supply chain, and the findings from that piece of work we anticipate will be shared with industry stakeholders in the sugarcane industry to help influence and inform policy developments. We're also very excited to be working on a project that's being coordinated through the Consumer Goods Forum, and this is setting up an ethical recruitment marketplace specifically in the Asia Pacific. And happy to talk to anybody further about the details of that, but that will include actors from many areas of business and human rights, as well as governments, to come together to really tackle the issue of forced labour in the region. Thanks.
Thanks, Nadia. I think a couple of things we can take away from those examples is it's not something that you do alone as a company or even with your business relationships. There's so much collaboration, so many different partners, stakeholders that you're working with that to really to try and address some of these issues. So that's really helpful to hear those examples. I'll ask Supan Nigamuni from Control Union Malaysia, the managing director there. Supan, from your perspective, working on the ground with supply chains in ASEAN, what are some of the most common gaps or challenges that you've observed in companies' due diligence efforts?
Yeah, on the ground reality is that many of the ASEAN companies, especially the MSME sector, still view due diligence more as a buyer-driven burden rather than an internal risk management tool, which you have also abilities to basically not only consider as a risk management tool, but also as a value creation tool. And we see challenges in the market, and we see opportunities and solutions also emerging. But what we see is actually, we're talking about regulatory environment. So the fragmented regulatory environment is actually one of the main challenges. So what we see is ASEAN countries are at different stages of adopting mandatory due diligence laws. So certain countries like Singapore, Malaysia have more mature ESG frameworks. And also what we, with these various enforcement standards is leading to uneven compliance expectations within the region. With that, there have been key drivers emerging, especially with the international regulations. EUDR, CBAM has been very material to the region. There was a nice question on omnibus and how it's basically going to, what's the uncertainty which is actually creating at the moment. And also what we see is the human rights, forced labor related laws in particular is actually has emerged as a key driver. In the same time, we see financial institutions and investors are also picking it up. So that's also driving. But the clear drive is still coming from customer demand, especially from customers in the more developed and more regulated economies, as well as certain government commitments. What we also see is that lack of supplier transparency. Many of the SMEs and upstream suppliers are not digitally traceable, especially when it comes to the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, often lacks also awareness of due diligence obligations. And most of these tier 2, tier 3 suppliers are MSMEs. And there's a need for a lot of support and guidance, because this is essentially a non-regulated sector. Even if you see the Malaysian context, the full supply chain under the NSRF, National Sustainable Reporting Frameworks, is only going to come in 2027. So it's a phased approach. And so that's why we also appreciate on the facts that we see ASEAN is coming together now, the co-carbon, the carbon markets frameworks, ASEAN carbon markets frameworks, and then also the common grid. And also recently we saw the launch of the ASEAN Simplified ESG Disclosure Guidance for SMEs in the supply chains, which is actually a right step forward, which is aimed to equip small and medium enterprises across ASEAN operating within global and local supply chains with a simplified reference guide to report their ESG disclosures, so they can link to various stakeholders, including customers, financiers, and investors. So those are right steps forward. And cost competitiveness is taking precedence over ESG for many exporters. Like what I said, they don't really see this as a don't see this as a risk management tool and a value creation tool. So this has led to, in certain cases, kind of checkbox compliance, not true behavioral change. So accountability is key, and ESG has to be done right, ideally with proper assurance. So there has to be checks and balances. And there's a lot of government support to basically drive it. Just to take a Malaysian context, for an example, Malaysia, we have Income Tax Act 1967 provisions for green certifications through MOF recognized solutions. And we also have domestic through MIDA, DIA for ESG adoption, and through MarTrade, there's market development grants, which all looks into various certification, carbon, ESG adoption. When we're talking about it, competency gaps, capacity gaps in terms of implementation is still weak, and there's still a lot of support needed. And companies struggle actually to translate these policy commitments into more operational procedures. And that's where we see even in Malaysia in 2023, MITI launched the IESG framework, and there's a lot of support being available by UNGC and other UN agencies making publicly available material. So there has been to be more and more capacity building requirements. And what we also see is that sustainability, especially in the MSME sector, is still being perceived as a department, or in most cases outsourcing responsibilities to external parties. So there has to be a need to build internal accountability, internal capacity. So sustainability is not a kind of isolated department, but ensured by embedding into everyday life in an organization. For the region, especially for a country like Malaysia, what we see is the labor and the land tenure issues are actually of quite critical, especially on cases like palm oil, rubber, seafood, garment supply chains, and there is still difficulty in proving free, prior, informed consent and human rights compliance. And but saying that, we see every day there's new regional initiatives emerging, push towards more developed countries' regulations, and our regulations are also going up, which I believe policy, whether it's private or public policy, will actually play a very important role. In the absence of public policy, we saw the private policy coming up in the beginning. Then we saw emergence of public policy. Now now the private policies and public policies are really driving this forward. So we are quite optimistic, even though there are challenges. What we are seeing is that we are taking right steps forward. So with time, I think a region will actually be ready to be a key driving force to global commodity supply chains.
Yeah, thank you. I think that need to, Emily mentioned the convening of policymakers that the OECD has been initiating. It's worth noting that a lot of policymakers from the region attended a number of, I think, 4 different ASEAN countries came to meet within March, global policy discussion on responsible business conduct, due diligence. We see this as key to bring people together because so much is changing. So trying to have some coherence across policy is going to go a long way to help people help companies navigate.
Absolutely.
So I'll pass to Sophie Dirksen now from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sophie, can you share with us how the Dutch government is supporting companies, particularly SMEs, to navigate the upcoming or existing due diligence legislation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. And I think we already heard that support is key. And I think what for me is really important to highlight as first is that the world we are in right now, with geopolitical shifts and disruptions to world trade, really highlights the importance of responsible business conduct. So trade tensions, but also increasing inflation have shown volatility of value change. And yet there's also growing consensus that trade must be sustainable and fair to safeguard and increase prosperity. And this is also important for the Netherlands. And we saw numerous developments and movements, as Emily already showed, for this at the national and European levels. For example, the CSDDD. However, I do think, and Emily mentioned it as well, and also Supun, that it's the current uncertainty about these developments that may cause some concerns about companies, both in the Netherlands as in Asia. And I think especially in Asia, the EU is still a potential market, but felt perhaps also difficult to navigate through the rise of high standards and RBC legislation or regulation. But with the current geopolitical developments and shifts also in the US, for example, EU might become an opportunity and continues to be, I think, really a potential and accessible big market also for Asia. Therefore, the Dutch government finds it really important, in collaboration, of course, with the European Commission, to support Dutch companies and navigate them through this agenda and really a puzzle, I think, of what we call business and human rights. And the way we do that is explained in our policy notes based on the OECD guidelines, of which due diligence is at heart. And the Dutch government has implemented a so-called smart mix of instruments with voluntary and binding mutually reinforcing measures to not only impose legislation or conditions for companies, but also to set financial incentives, facilitation, and the provision of information to conduct due diligence. And what's really important to note here is that the basis is not only that we are providing information, for example, but especially sharing the know-how and facilitating peer-to-peer learning, for example. And if I still have 1 minute, I want to highlight a few of the action we undertake. So first of all, the Dutch government provides grants and subsidies to Dutch companies that engage in responsible business conduct. We also subsidize, for example, the RBC Risk Checker. It's a checker available in English and accessible to everyone, for everyone to use. We also facilitate sector-wide cooperations through our sectoral agreements, for example, on textiles, renewable energy, or natural stone. And in these agreements, Dutch, but also international companies and civil society organizations work together to tackle RBC-related issues and to make progress on conducting due diligence. So I think one important is also that we set up an RBC help desk. So it's a help desk for any company, but primarily focused on SMEs that wants to conduct business responsible, regardless of whether it's their own choice or whether they are required to by law now or in the future, but doesn't know how or where to start actually. And the colleagues that work on this help desk, the team, they give advice alongside the OECD guidelines, and they also provide tools and e-learnings and do webinars. And they have topical but also regional expertise. I just want to notice that the service is only available for Dutch companies and their head offices actually, but I think also for local companies and companies in Asia, involve your head office also in the processes and the difficulties that might arise when you conduct due diligence, and share that also to them, that you also, for example, want to make use of instruments that are linked to the head office in the Netherlands, for example. And last but not least, we also slide forward our embassies to take up this supporting role. And for the Asian 5, a regional policy officer, RBC, has recently started. I think she's also in the room. She has more in-depth RBC knowledge, contextualized for this specific region, and also a quite big network with experts and organizations that could support or provide information. So I hope that provides a decent overview of our activities, and I do think indeed giving support is key in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. There's lots there, which is great. If there are any links you wanted to share in the chat, perhaps to the risk checker, if you're able to do that, that would be great.
Yes,
now,
I can do that.
Thank you. And we have, if anybody wants to add their questions to the chat, we've got one in there which we can go to in a moment. I might. Actually, I'll quickly put that to Emily, just to, I think that would be quite a quick response, probably, that Amy Fan's question. And then I've got one more question for our 3 panelists, which while they're answering that, any questions from the floor people would like to put into the chat, then we'll try and get to that as well. So Emily, on the uncertainty around CSDDD, your advice.
Thanks, Kate. And yeah, I like your confidence that it's a quick response, because it is a big question. And I appreciate I didn't give a lot of time to the discussions that are happening in the CSDD. I mean, just to say, of course, there's uncertainty, and the timing for the application of CSDD, also the CSRD, have both, of course, been pushed. So we're already looking at 2028. From an OECD standards perspective, as I was saying earlier, due diligence is out there. It's not going away. It's sitting in other laws. So it's sitting in the forced labor laws, both US, EU. It's sitting in, admittedly, a different definition of slightly, but in the deforestation. It's sitting in the disclosure requirements. It's sitting at the national level. So certainly the recommendation in terms of dealing with that uncertainty while it's there, again, noting we're some time off, is really to think about the international frameworks and to start with those. Those really are the basis of a lot more than just CSDD. And so that's going to get you, as I was saying, like 70% there. And let's see where the tweaks might need to be made or not with CSDD. The only thing I'd add, Kate, and noting we want to keep the time, so I don't want to talk too long, but we are looking at a very risky and fragmented landscape without CSDD, which really was trying to harmonize expectations across the EU. We risk going back, of course, to a much more fragmented landscape where we're looking at not only national frameworks that will almost certainly start emerging and will, of course, be slightly different. We'll then be left with quite a lot of issue-specific frameworks, which again, coherence issues there, and then, of course, the harder, I would say, the harder edge of the product bans from the US. The deforestation will be there to stay, so you end up actually they will almost gain more weight, and obviously have quite a strict enforcement mechanism. And then, of course, there might be a lot more emphasis on reporting, but I think it would be a much more fragmented landscape. But let's see. Last point there is that I think it's extremely uncertain. There's also I hear a lot of momentum for trying to do something that is much more consistent with the international standards and risk-based than what was proposed in the Commission's omnibus. So there's a lot of discussion happening. I don't think we should be leaping to conclusions, actually, even on the German position, which I hear moves around. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
The OECD guidelines are set and aren't going anywhere. So that would also be my pitch, is to turn to the OECD guidelines for some certainty on the topics, on the substance of how responsible business conduct can be implemented. I have a last question for our three panelists, which really relates to the smaller companies that don't have a sustainability department necessarily. These small companies that are just starting on a journey of understanding due diligence, perhaps because their customer is asking questions around for their own due diligence, and they might be operating when they're operating in ASEAN. So for small companies, what advice do you give a small company that is starting their journey of conducting due diligence and their understanding of this process? I'll go to Sophie.
Yes, thank you, Kate. I think I really want to link to the myths that Emily already explained. So I can imagine also for smaller companies that it feels quite overwhelming seeing those 6 steps. Where do I need to start? And I think it's really important to emphasize again that you can prioritize and you don't have to do it perfect at once. So just get started. Due diligence doesn't have to be perfect. See what are your rights holders in your first tier, for example. Start the dialogue by speaking to your suppliers, getting some first feelings of how your supply chain is working right now, and make small steps, big impacts, I think, with that. And also seek frontrunners or peers within your sector where you can scale up your activities with, so you don't have to do this alone. I think that's my advice.
Thank you. And Supan?
Yeah, I agree with the same. So basically, sustainability and different companies are at different maturity. So it's very important. I would like to echo what Sophie was actually saying. So basically, start with prioritization. You are in different industries. You are in different maturity levels. Your ambitions, your aspirations are different. What your stakeholders are asking for. So focus on the most salient risks, whether it's actually labor-related risks, deforestation-related risks, sourcing-related risks. So start focusing on those. Identify where you are, like we develop any other business plan. So where we are now, where we want to be, and then basically how to get there. In terms of how to getting there, so that's where competency capacity is actually very important. There's a lot of free tools, guidance from OECD, like what you said, from ILO, from UNGC, and the other industry groups and industry associations. There's a lot of free sources are available. There's a lot of initiatives, a lot of trainings are being done. Get engaged in your local networks and associations. But very important, basically start identifying where you are first, and with your stakeholders, with your materiality mapping, identify where you want to be, set your goals, KPIs, and basically drive clear plans, appoint responsibilities, and go there. And in terms of, even though you are SMEs, it's still very important to look into your scope 3 as well, because your scope 1 and scope 2 becomes the bigger company scope 3. Same, like you can also make a big impact in terms of responsible sourcing and in compliance. So your scope 3 is also very important. So start building up a traceability map, even if it is incomplete. Know your tier 1s, know your tier 2s, start engaging with your suppliers, how small you are, get engaged. So this is something that we can drive from collective effort, because everything is actually linked. So there's a big role to play for the large MSME contribution across the region.
Thanks, Chupan. And Nadia?
I think it's already all been covered, but I would absolutely echo everything that the other panelists have said. Simplicity, start small. I think a key point for me is focus on a few key things that drive impact rather than trying to do lots of different things. Saliency is absolutely fundamental to a risk-based approach. So look at where the severity and likelihood of those risks are greatest and start there and focus on that, because that's what the human rights due diligence guidelines, the UNGPs, is asking for. It's asking for you to prioritize. So you're not expected to do everything. So focus and keep it simple.
Yeah, great. And there is one question here about interpreting human rights. So what we're talking about here today are the international standards on human rights. So that's for the full kind of explanation of what sorts of rights we're talking about. The UNGPs have these articulated, and the OECD guidelines, so we can make sure those links are provided alongside the materials. That's Jip Tunan's question. So I'll pass back to Petra because we're at time. But if anybody did want to stay on and ask further questions, some of us can stay for a few minutes after. If you didn't get a chance, we won't drop off straight away, and you will receive the slides from today. But
thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, on behalf of the ASEAN Dutch Chamber Network, as well as our partners at the OECD, I want to thank you all for joining the insightful presentation. Thank you to the panelists and the speakers. There are some very insightful and informative responses. As Kate already mentioned, we will be sharing the slides with you. In the chat today, you will find our website of the ADCN if you want to stay in touch with other topics that we're talking about. And if you have some further questions, or if you would like some follow-up to this, we also have an email address, which is communications@adcn.asia. If you have specific questions to any of the panelists or any of the speakers, we can forward it to them and then get back to you on those questions. But as Kate mentioned, if any of you want to stay on for another 5-10 minutes and have some more questions for the panelists, very welcome to do so. But we're very conscious of the fact that everyone's busy and would like to move on to the next order of business. So it's up to you. Thank you again for your attention. I think a very insightful meeting and hopefully food for thought.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If this was in real life, we could go and have a cup of tea or coffee and chat over tea or coffee.
I think so. I don't know if anyone in the group still has some questions they would like to ask, because we're staying with a select few. I'll just select a few. I don't think it looks like anyone is brave enough to ask a question. Thank you again for your participation. And I think, yeah, if we have any further questions, we will forward it to you and then we can get back to people. So thank you. Very interesting.
No, thanks.
Thanks
Petra,
for
I might just come in quickly to say to Petra, no, super helpful. And I think from our side, we are doing quite a bit of broader work as well on looking at the needs and challenges in different regions.
Yep.
And we've got a new capacity building sort of modules and projects that we're launching or working on. It would be great to, if there are specific laws coming up, specific issues, specific questions coming up, it's always helpful for us to see those.
Definitely, yeah. No, I think well, Yannick has all our contact information. I'm quite happy to share.
Yeah.
I think Kate by now has my email as well, but happy to stay in touch. I think very important topics coming up, and like you said, in an ever fragmented world, it's good that we can unite on some things. Yeah, definitely.
Great. No, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Enjoy for the rest of your day, especially for the European lot, and have a nice evening for us Asians. See
Bye.
you all soon. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.